The early autumn morning in Flaxborough was of the sort that made one think the town was precisely the right size. Big enough for gossip to multiply, small enough for no one to escape it. A gentle mist clung to the streets like a damp shawl, softening the edges of the lace curtains in the windows along Market Street. It was the kind of morning when no one expected anything remarkable to occur. Unless, of course, one counted the weekly routines of Mrs. Gidney's flower shop, Mr. Bloxam's fishmongery, or Mr. Appledaw's chemist shop, the latter of which, as it happened, would shortly prove the scene of an unexpected disturbance. Inspector Purbright, whose office overlooked the triangular garden opposite the town hall, had noted the mist but remained indifferent to it. He had, in fact, been meditating on the curious precision with which townsfolk managed to appear busy while achieving very little of consequence. His pen moved idly across the blotter, recording administrative tasks that were unlikely to demand action before next week. The first suggestion of irregularity arrived quietly with Mr. Appledaw himself. He appeared at the inspector's door precisely at 9:23 a.m., which was an hour too early for most emergencies in Flaxborough. His spectacles perched precariously on a high bridge of a nose that tended to redden at the slightest exertion, and his eyes darted about the office as if seeking a hidden witness. "Inspector Purbright," he began, with the hesitancy of a man unused to upsetting routine.
I fear there's been a matter of some irregularity at the shop." Purbright inclined his head politely. "Yes, Mr. Appledore, please do sit."
"I trust nothing serious has occurred?" "Serious?" the chemist swallowed. "Well, perhaps not dangerous to life, but certainly to order, to proper procedure, to reputation, if I might be so bold." Purbright's lips twitched. Reputation was in Flaxborough often a more pressing concern than health or safety. "The issue," Appledore continued, fumbling with his handkerchief, "concerns a measure. One of our standard brass measures for weighing chemical powders."
"It is missing," Purbright raised an eyebrow.
A missing measure, he noted, was not a headline crime. Yet the meticulousness of a chemist's mind lent gravity to such trifles. One could not ignore an irregularity simply because it appeared trivial. The implications for accuracy and, more pressingly, suspicion were considerable. "Missing, you say?" Purbright asked softly.
"And when did you first notice?"
"This morning, sir, before opening. I performed the routine check and, well, it was not there. Not on its usual hook behind the counter." Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Was there any evidence of forced entry? Disturbance?
Any sign that someone else has been in your premises overnight?"
Appledore shook his head so vigorously the spectacles wobbled. "No, Inspector, not at all. Everything is exactly as it was yesterday evening. I locked up as usual. Nothing disturbed. Yet the measure vanished. It was a quiet, peculiar sort of theft. Not a robbery, not an act of aggression, but a subtle misplacement that threatened the chemist's fastidious order. Purbright made a note of it, not on the blotter but in his mind. Lost measure. No sign of forced entry. Morning discovery." There was something in the phrasing of "exactly as it was yesterday evening" that suggested Appledore believed in the absolute fidelity of routine, a reliability that, in Purbright's experience, was often misleading. "Have you any idea?" Purbright ventured. "Who might have handled the measure yesterday?" Appledore hesitated.
"Only myself, really."
"And perhaps my assistant, Miss Letty Fowle, but she is most diligent."
"Never careless." Purbright made no comment, though internally he filed the name.
Miss Letty Fowle, young, sharp, polite to the point of stiffness, and prone to arriving early to organize the shop. Perfectly competent, yet the sort of person whose very conscientiousness could conceal inadvertent errors. "Very well," Purbright said, rising. "I shall, of course, pay a visit to the shop. I would like to see the area for myself." Outside, the mist had begun to thin, revealing the familiar bustle of a market day. Horse-drawn deliveries clopped along cobbled streets, the baker's cart jingled with metal, and an elderly woman tripped delicately over the curbstone, narrowly avoiding collision with a bicyclist. All ordinary, all predictable, except now for a missing measure at the chemist's. At Mr. Appledaw's shop, Purbright observed the interior with the calm of one used to studying minor disorder. The brass measure was indeed absent from its hook. Small glass bottles glinted on shelves, powders of various colours rested in neat containers, and labels proclaimed chemical virtues with gentle authority. Miss Fowle was arranging boxes behind the counter, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. "Good morning, Inspector," she said with a courteous nod.
Everything prepared for the day. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the counter,
where an empty space hinted at absence. "Good morning, Miss Fowle. I hear there is a small irregularity." She blinked, not in fear but in mild surprise.
"Oh, you mean the measure?"
"Yes, I noticed it too when Mr. Appledore called it out." Purbright's expression remained neutral, his mind quietly evaluating.
"I see, and you have no idea where it might have gone?"
"None at all," she replied promptly. "I would have seen if it had been misplaced." A polite, yet revealing certainty. One noted the language, would have seen. Not did not see, which might imply oversight, but a confident assertion of attentiveness. He filed this away, a minor clue, but not yet a key. Purbright's gaze wandered over the counter again, noting a faint smudge of powder on the edge of a small mortar. He crouched slightly, observing the pattern. Not careless.
Not recently disturbed.
And yet, he thought, someone has been here, handling measures, perhaps without due caution, or with particular intent. Perhaps, Miss Fowle, it was simply moved during cleaning, he suggested, speaking as one proposes a distant possibility. Her lips tightened.
"I would know, Inspector. I'm quite thorough." Purbright inclined his head.
Diligence, he reflected, can sometimes disguise the unlikeliest of oversights, or occasionally a deliberate misplacement. But for now, speculation would serve no purpose. Outside, Flaxborough settled into its rhythm. The scent of autumn leaves mingled with the bakery's warm offerings. The postman tipped his hat to passing ladies, and the market square filled with chatter. Yet, a small disruption, just a missing measure, would ripple quietly through the town in the coming hours, drawing opinions, guesses, and the inevitable gossip that would, in due course, require careful navigation by Inspector Purbright. For now, he returned to the office, taking with him the faint impression of disorder under a veneer of calm, the whisper of a minor mystery waiting for its proper time. And as ever, Purbright considered that small things could be the seed of larger truths, though, naturally, larger truths were rarely obvious until the final moment. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had fully awakened, though its residents carried themselves with the air of enduring a minor inconvenience rather than a bustling market day. The missing measure at Mr. Appledore's shop had begun its quiet migration through the town, not as confirmed fact, but as conjecture embroidered with personal perspective. It was the sort of incident that, in a place accustomed to routine, quickly acquired a significance beyond its intrinsic gravity. Mrs. Gidney, arranging chrysanthemums in her shop window, had heard of the disappearance from a neighbour's passing remark. She tilted her head, frowning delicately, and muttered to herself about the need for diligence in a chemist's counter. By the time the postman swung past with letters and the occasional parcel, he too had absorbed the tale and added, as a casual aside, that the missing measure could only be the work of someone careless or peculiarly motivated. At the Flowering Lily Café, where a group of retired magistrates convened each Thursday, speculation was more pointed. Mr. Trelawney, in particular, found the concept of a lost brass measure unsettling. "In my day," he said, shaking his head over a cup of weak tea, "accuracy was everything. One could not tolerate a slip, however slight." Mrs. Holbrook, sitting opposite, smirked politely, her lace gloves tapping the table. "And yet," she remarked, "it is remarkable how often little errors reveal character far more effectively than any grand gesture." The others murmured in agreement, careful not to draw the attention of the waiter, who had ears as sharp as his teaspoon. Gossip, as it must, began to mutate. By 11:30, One could hear whispers along Market Street suggesting that perhaps the measure had been taken intentionally, a deliberate act of sabotage or mischief. Children, drawn by the excitement of disruption, whispered to each other behind their mothers' skirts, while grocers and bakers exchanged knowing glances, eyes glinting with the delight of vicarious intrigue. Purbright, watching from the office window, noted the precise cadence with which a story expanded when unfettered by evidence. His own inquiries, while unobtrusive, were informed by these murmurs. A brief visit to the butcher revealed little. Mr. Kilbride, sharpening his knives, expressed indignation at the very notion of theft in such a respectable town. "Surely, Inspector," he said, flourished a meat cleaver with a casual gesture, "you do not suggest someone would tamper with Appledaw's property?" Purbright nodded, though internally he recorded the slight inflection in Kilbride's voice, the hint of self-conscious emphasis that often accompanied defensive statements. At the chemist's, Miss Fowle maintained her composure, though she now observed the small crowd assembling outside, drawn by the subtle murmur of a potential crime. Purbright, as always, refrained from commenting aloud. It was better to allow others to reveal themselves through their reactions, for the human tendency to overcompensate when observed was one of his most reliable guides. By noon, Mr. Appledaw himself had begun to fret, pacing behind the counter, spectacles sliding perilously down his nose, muttering about lost precision and compromised integrity. His voice, though not loud, carried enough to attract the attention of Mrs. Rees, the town librarian, who paused in passing to inquire whether any actual evidence of tampering existed. Appledaw responded with the full breadth of his anxiety, and the librarian retreated, content that the situation, while serious in Appledaw's mind, remained suitably contained in the everyday flow of Flaxborough life. Meanwhile, Purbright took a measured stroll through the streets, exchanging brief pleasantries with shopkeepers, observing subtle interactions that suggested alliances, rivalries, and quiet pride. At the Hatters, Mrs. Fenwick confided in a whisper about a cousin of hers who had once worked in a chemist's shop and had a reputation for misplacing instruments. Purbright nodded politely, filing the remark without judgment, aware that reputations, like stories, tended to acquire embellishments over time. By mid-afternoon, the speculation had crystallized into two dominant interpretations. One, that the measure had been accidentally misplaced by Miss Fowle during a routine cleaning. The other, more daringly, that it had been purloined by an unknown party with motives that remained obscure. The local newspaper, ever alert for such delicate curiosities, promised a small paragraph in the next morning's edition, though nothing more sensational would be necessary to rouse interest. Purbright returned to Appledaw's in the late afternoon, observing the chemist's behaviour more closely now that the initial flurry of gossip had begun to settle into predictable patterns.
Appledaw's hands trembled slightly as he arranged small glass jars.
The tremor was not fear, exactly, but a faint manifestation of anxiety, the sort that often accompanied meticulous minds confronted with disorder. Miss Fowle, meanwhile, appeared to take particular pleasure in maintaining the shop's order, rearranging bottles and brushes with almost obsessive precision, as though the act itself might counterbalance the unknown irregularity. At the town hall, the mayor and a few councillors convened to discuss municipal business, and inevitably the conversation turned toward the chemist.
"A brass measure missing in our midst," said the mayor, shaking his head.
"Perhaps not a crime, but certainly a breach of trust." The councillors murmured assent. Purbright, discreetly present at a distance, noted the exact cadence and emphasis of their words. The performance of concern often eclipsed the factual basis, revealing not only their stance on the incident, but also their own anxieties about order and propriety. By evening, Flaxborough had settled into a peculiar equilibrium. Shopkeepers closed shutters with the tacit understanding that the day had brought enough excitement to feed conversation for a week. Children had been corralled home. Gossip had been delivered, embellished, and partially forgotten. And yet the missing measure remained absent, a quiet fulcrum upon which the small town had balanced its attentions. Purbright returned to his office, making detailed notes on the personalities, habits, and reactions he had observed throughout the day. The subtle variations, the emphasis in a word, a furtive glance, a slight tightening of a hand, were the threads from which truth could be drawn, provided one waited patiently. For the moment, the mystery was small and circumscribed, yet he knew from experience that such incidents often expanded in significance, revealing the peculiarities of character and the invisible pressures that maintained social order in Flaxborough. He allowed himself a faint smile as he considered the day's events. In a town of predictable routines, even a missing measure could awaken insight into human nature, and tomorrow, he reflected, might well provide further indication of the motives and opportunities behind the incident, assuming, of course, that Flaxborough's residents continued to follow their curiosity with the same quiet fervour that had carried it thus far. As dusk approached, the street lamps flickered to life, casting soft pools of light along cobbled paths. The market square emptied, leaving only the faint echo of conversation and the scent of autumn leaves. Purbright returned to his blotter, methodically recording the small details that would later prove significant. The missing measure, unremarkable in itself, had become the catalyst for observation, reflection, and, ultimately, a series of discoveries that the town would scarcely suspect until the precise moment. The following morning dawned with an unusual clarity, the mist of the previous day replaced by pale sunlight that slanted obliquely across Market Street. Flaxborough, as always, assumed the outward appearance of ordinary life. Shutters were opened, deliveries made, and the occasional clop of horses' hooves punctuated the rhythm of the town. Yet beneath the superficial calm, the disappearance of the chemist's measure had already begun to influence behaviour. There were furtive glances exchanged at corners, whispers carefully pitched so as not to carry, and the discreet avoidance of eye contact among certain shopkeepers. Inspector Purbright set out with his habitual deliberation, his overcoat buttoned tightly against the lingering chill. He had no intention of announcing his inquiries too broadly. The purpose of a first inspection, he thought, was to observe the manner in which individuals reacted when the potential for scrutiny existed without being overtly applied. The chemist's shop, naturally, formed the first point of interest. Miss Letty Fowle was already at the counter, her posture impeccable, hands resting lightly atop the polished surface. Her eyes followed the inspector with polite attention, though he noted the brief flicker of something almost imperceptible, perhaps surprise, perhaps calculation, as he entered. Purbright began with casual questions, inviting her to recount the events of the previous day in her own words. She complied with precision, enumerating her tasks, the order in which she had handled bottles and powders, the timing of Mr. Appledaw's morning review, and the checks she had performed. Yet as she spoke, Purbright observed small contradictions, a pause here,
A minor hesitation there, an overemphasis on diligence.
none sufficient in isolation to indicate culpability, but collectively they suggested a nervousness unaccounted for by mere pride in routine. He filed the observations silently, noting, as always, that truth in Flaxborough rarely resided in grand gestures. It often lurked in the inflection of a word, the angle of a head, or the spacing between sentences. Turning next to Mr. Appledaw himself, Purbright asked a few direct questions about the measure's last known use. Appledore responded with considerable agitation, his hands twisting the edges of a handkerchief. "I verified every shelf," he insisted.
Every hook?
"The brass measure should have been in its place."
I cannot fathom. His voice faltered slightly.
The inspector allowed the pause to linger, permitting the chemist to articulate more of his anxiety than a direct inquiry would have elicited. After a quiet moment, Purbright asked about potential visitors to the shop the previous day. Appledore hesitated. "Only Mr. Holcomb, the council surveyor. He came for a consultation regarding the new signage for the town square, but he handled nothing, I assure you. No one touched the measures. Purbright filed the name for reference, noting that in Flaxborough, even the most innocuous visit could acquire significance when viewed through the prism of obsession with order and propriety. Moving beyond the chemist's establishment, the inspector conducted brief interviews with the baker, the butcher, and the tobacconist. Each provided accounts tinged with personal interpretation. The baker suggested that shop assistants were often careless, though his own were nothing if not conscientious. The butcher spoke of flustered clerks in general, noting the danger of distraction in routine tasks. The tobacconist offered the opinion that minor thefts were occasionally motivated by resentment at perceived superiority. Purbright listened politely to each reflection, extracting the subtle undercurrents of suspicion without committing judgment. By mid-morning, he had noted an interesting pattern. Nearly every resident he spoke to had something to say about diligence, responsibility, or negligence, but few addressed the event itself. It was, he realized, a feature of Flaxborough's social rhythm that the character of individuals often overshadowed the factual elements of an incident. This observation, while obvious to him, would form the framework upon which the rest of the inquiry could proceed. At the Flowering Lily Cafe, Purbright encountered Mrs. Holbrook once more, engaged in a whispered conversation with Mr. Trelawney. They paused briefly as he approached, exchanging smiles that carried the precise measure of condescension and cordiality peculiar to long acquaintance. Purbright inquired lightly after their morning activities, and Mrs. Holbrook, in a voice pitched for civility, mentioned that she had overheard Miss Fowle express relief that the measure had not been used in an error-prone transaction. The remark, ostensibly innocent, contained an emphasis on relief that drew Purbright's quiet attention. Later, a chance encounter with the postman revealed that a parcel addressed to Appledore had been returned unexpectedly, having lingered uncollected overnight at the sorting office. Purbright noted the timing. The parcel had arrived prior to the measure's disappearance. Nothing about the package itself suggested theft, yet its delayed delivery provided an opportunity for misplacement that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Details such as this, seemingly trivial, were the sort of threads Purbright was accustomed to examining. By early afternoon, Purbright had compiled a roster of observations and minor inconsistencies: Miss Fowle's overemphasized diligence, Appledore's anxious repetitions, a returned parcel, and the slightly exaggerated warnings about carelessness heard from multiple sources. None of these elements, singly or combined, amounted to proof, yet the pattern began to suggest that an explanation existed somewhere between routine oversight and deliberate act. Returning briefly to the chemist's shop, Purbright posed a casual question regarding the measure's storage habits. Miss Fowle replied promptly, describing a meticulous arrangement of hooks and compartments. Purbright noted the phrasing, "I always ensure," the habitual assertion of thoroughness. He allowed a pause before remarking, almost conversationally, that even the most orderly systems could conceal errors. Miss Fowle inclined her head, smiling faintly, neither defensive nor guilty, though he sensed the mental calculation occurring behind those eyes. By late afternoon, the town had again settled into a familiar rhythm, as if the morning's stirrings had been a temporary diversion. Shopkeepers attended to customers, the market square carried the scent of baked goods and autumn leaves, and children darted among the cobbles, unsuspicious of the intricacies that were quietly observed by the inspector. Flaxborough presented its ordinary face, yet beneath it, Purbright considered, small tensions and unresolved questions lingered like the faint trace of mist along Market Street. As dusk approached, he returned to his office, reviewing the notes, impressions, and subtle patterns of behavior he had observed. The initial inquiries had revealed nothing overtly criminal, yet small inconsistencies and carefully phrased remarks suggested avenues that required patient follow-up. Purbright reflected on the essential principle: in Flaxborough, truth rarely announced itself. It was coaxed from the shadows, extracted from nuance, and revealed through the quiet interplay of human nature and circumstance. By the time evening settled over the town, the missing measure remained unfound and the puzzle quietly deepened. For Purbright, this was neither discouragement nor surprise. Rather, it was confirmation that the rhythm of investigation in a town such as Flaxborough required patience, discernment, and an understanding that even the most trivial incident could illuminate the most revealing truths. By mid-morning, the day had gained a briskness that seemed to unsettle the usual ease of Market Street. Flaxborough, outwardly placid, now carried the faint tension of speculation, as if the air itself had acquired a small charge. The missing measure at Appledores had begun to crystallize in people's minds as an event worth interpretation, and interpretations, as always, were readily supplied. Purbright, mindful of the town's tendency to conflate conjecture with certainty, observed without comment the discreet glances cast toward the chemist's shop, the lowered lids and pursed lips that accompanied passing remarks. The mannered discussions paused mid-sentence when he happened into view. The first candidate for suspicion presented himself.
Naturally, through the medium of conversation, Mr. Holcomb,
The council surveyor who had visited Appledore the previous day was known for his punctuality and somewhat officious manner. He appeared at the town hall precisely when Purbright expected him, ostensibly to discuss new signage, yet with a degree of vigilance that suggested he was conscious of being observed. The inspector's inquiries were measured, careful. Holcomb's account of his visit was precise, almost rehearsed, but the faint tightness around his eyes and the frequent adjustment of his tie hinted at unease. Purbright noted these signals. In Flaxborough, unease often revealed as much as confession. Meanwhile, the chemist, observing the inspector's attentions to Holcomb, appeared both relieved and anxious. Appledore's hands trembled slightly as he poured tea for himself, his eyes darting between Purbright and the surveyor. Miss Fowle, in contrast, maintained an impeccable composure, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter as if to reassure herself of the constancy of physical order. Purbright found the contrast telling. Some anxiety was expected. Others performed calm as a shield. Holcomb, asked about his actions during the visit, emphasized that he had handled nothing, touched nothing, and remained strictly to the matter of signage. His words were precise, clipped, each carefully selected to preclude ambiguity. Yet there was something in the almost imperceptible hesitation when he referenced the rear of the shop, a slight pause, a change in pitch that drew Purbright's quiet attention. The inspector allowed the moment to linger, knowing that the human mind, when faced with minor scrutiny, often betrayed more than it intended. Later, Purbright walked the length of the street, reviewing the day's pattern of gossip. Mrs. Gidney's flowers were still neatly arranged, yet a small knot of women lingered near her door, exchanging opinions on the potential for negligence or mischief. Mr. Trelawney, overheard from a respectful distance, speculated that a measure so conspicuously absent could only result from carelessness or deliberate concealment. Purbright noted the emphasis on motive over fact. In Flaxborough, motive was the lens through which all acts were interpreted. Back at the chemist's, a small but peculiar detail caught Purbright's attention. A drawer, ordinarily closed and locked, was slightly ajar. Inside were small slips of paper with chemical notations. Nothing unusual in themselves, but one contained a note, apparently overlooked, with the faint impression of a thumbprint in a smudge of powder. The mark was indistinct, perhaps accidental, yet to Purbright it suggested movement, handling, and an unguarded moment. Small things such as this, he reflected, often led further than grand gestures ever could. Appledore's anxiety, while understandable, now assumed a rhythmic quality. He paced the floor in short bursts, glancing toward the drawer, the counter, and Miss Fowle in turn. Each action was meticulously observed by Purbright, who quietly catalogued gestures, patterns, and the subtle alignment of behavior with statements given earlier. Miss Fowle's continued composure contrasted sharply with her employer's visible disquiet, A dynamic Purbright filed without remark, but with an awareness of its significance, Holcomb, leaving the shop after an hour-long discussion about local council matters, displayed a particular briskness in his walk, head slightly down, hands clasped behind his back. Purbright followed at a discreet distance, noting the occasional glance over the shoulder, the faint stiffness of gait, the adjustment of collar. Small, seemingly irrelevant movements, yet the inspector understood their import. They hinted at consciousness of scrutiny, a recognition that even minor actions might be observed and interpreted. By mid-afternoon, a pattern of human behavior began to emerge. Anxiety, composure, rehearsed innocence, and small, inadvertent signals collectively painted a more nuanced tableau than the initial gossip or simple facts could provide. The town, Purbright noted, was invested in appearances. The residents' concern often reflected their own sense of propriety rather than the actual circumstances of the missing measure. During a quiet walk near the riverside, Purbright observed the delivery boys and errand runners, noting that even they spoke of the measure with cautious curiosity. No one suggested theft openly. The language was hedged, tentative, almost ritualistically polite. Yet each conversation revealed assumptions, biases, and opinions that, when combined, formed a web of insight about the town's social network, allegiances, and minor resentments. Returning to the chemist's as the sun slanted toward the western roofs, Purbright examined the counter and the slightly ajar drawer once more. The thumbprint in powder, he considered, was the sort of trivial irregularity most would dismiss, yet in combination with behavioral cues, it suggested an opportunity for misplacement or deliberate removal. He allowed himself the faintest sense of anticipation, for in Flaxborough, subtle clues often presaged the unravelling of a more intricate thread. As evening approached, the town's routine resumed with measured calm. Shopkeepers prepared to close, children returned home, and the quiet air settled over the market square. Yet within the chemist's shop, small tensions lingered, Appledaw's careful pacing, Miss Fowle's poised attention, and the memory of Holcomb's slightly tense demeanour. Purbright considered the day's inquiries complete, for now, with the knowledge that initial suspicions often required refinement, and that even a seemingly obvious candidate might prove misleading when examined with patience. He returned to his office as the street lamps flickered to life, noting the interplay of shadows along the cobbles. The missing measure remained absent, the first suspect identified yet not confirmed, and a minor irregularity quietly observed. A single smudge, a slight hesitation, a drawn breath, hinting at layers yet to be revealed. Purbright allowed himself the satisfaction of preparation, knowing that the unassuming details collected today would serve as the foundation for further inquiries, delicate tests, and the eventual elucidation of truth in Flaxborough. By the following morning, Flaxborough had resumed the rhythm of its habitual civility, though the disappearance of the chemist's measure remained a quiet undercurrent in conversation.
Even the most mundane activities, children collecting milk, the butcher preparing cuts,
The baker arranging bread were subtly influenced by the story, each participant acutely aware that some small disruption had occurred. Purbright, methodical as ever, noted the way a minor anomaly shaped interactions, creating fleeting expressions of curiosity, restraint, or guardedness. He began his day at the chemist's once more, observing Miss Fowle arranging bottles and preparing the shop for customers. The young assistant greeted him politely, but with a faint tension in her posture, as if she had anticipated his presence. Purbright allowed the observation to settle without comment, noting that anxiety in Flaxborough, when properly framed, often revealed as much about the observer as the observed. As the morning progressed, Purbright expanded his inquiries. He called upon Mr. Bloxam, the fishmonger, who spoke readily of the chemist's situation, but added a personal reflection on the unreliability of certain assistants he had once employed. "They mean well," he said, polishing a knife, "but a small oversight can ripple through a day like a stone dropped in a pond."
One must not dismiss such things lightly. Purbright listened attentively,
recording not the factual statement but the subtle admission of his own past experience, which suggested a broader understanding of human carelessness. Mrs. Fenwick, the hatter, proved a more intriguing encounter. She spoke with genteel discretion about the chemist's shop, offering conjectures on who might have had opportunity to displace the measure. Her words were heavily qualified. She would not accuse directly, yet she hinted at certain individuals whose routines intersected with Appledaw's in ways that could facilitate oversight or more deliberate action. Purbright noted the phrasing carefully, the use of suggestion rather than assertion, the reliance on observation over direct knowledge. It was, as always, the small signals that carried weight. In the afternoon, the inspector visited the library, where Mrs. Rees commented on the way Flaxborough's residents had begun to discuss the measure in whispers rather than direct statements. She suggested that human nature inclined toward moral interpretation, even in matters that were trivial. Purbright, considering her words, reflected that she herself exemplified this principle, measured, courteous, observant, without intrusion. His own pattern of inquiry, he recognized, relied upon similar restraint, a methodical patience that allowed others to reveal their own thoughts while remaining unaware of scrutiny. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had gathered a collection of minor grievances and minor secrets: Mrs. Gidney's irritation at Mr. Appledaw's presumed sloppiness, the baker's subtle complaint regarding the late delivery of sugar, and the postman's quiet vexation at parcels left uncollected. None of these connected directly to the missing measure, yet each suggested the currents of resentment and irritation that subtly influenced human behavior. In a town like Flaxborough, these undercurrents could amplify small irregularities into incidents of perceived significance. Returning briefly to the chemist's shop, Purbright noticed that Miss Fowle had repositioned several bottles differently than the previous day. A slight shift in arrangement, though minor, suggested that she had engaged in deliberate organization. He considered the possibility that a previously overlooked item might now be revealed by the subtle reordering of objects. Appledaw, meanwhile, hovered near the counter, wringing his hands, the tension between his meticulous mind and the reality of imperfection playing out in minute gestures. An unanticipated encounter with Mr. Trelawney provided additional nuance. The retired magistrate spoke of human habit, of the tendency to repeat patterns that simultaneously reveal and conceal character. Purbright listened closely, noting the cadences of speech and the particular emphasis on words such as routine, carelessness, and opportunity. Small phrasing choices, in his experience, often offered insight into the speaker's unconscious assumptions, as well as potential misjudgments about the event in question. Later in the day, Purbright returned to the market square, observing interactions at the Flowering Lily Cafe. Mrs. Holbrook remarked on the chemist's predicament with a polite smile, yet her tone carried a faint inflection of judgment.
An evaluation of responsibility rather than fact.
Nearby patrons contributed muted opinions, none overtly accusatory, yet each layering the incident with social interpretation. The town's collective imagination, Purbright noted, often extended far beyond the bounds of actuality, forming a narrative in which small deviations assumed significance. By evening, several subtle coincidences had emerged. A delivery had been misdirected, minor objects shifted in a pattern inconsistent with strict routine, and fleeting glances exchanged between town figures hinted at unspoken awareness. Each was trivial in isolation, yet collectively they suggested that opportunity, oversight, and minor personal agendas could intersect to produce the missing measure's absence. Purbright reflected that this confluence, rather than outright malice, was more likely responsible for the current uncertainty. As dusk fell, Purbright walked slowly back toward his office. Noting the lamplight casting faint shadows along the cobbles, he considered the day's accumulated impressions. The interplay of observation, conjecture, and human behavior had expanded the field of inquiry considerably. revealing a town alive with minor tensions and subtle motivations. The missing measure, still unaccounted for, had now assumed the role of a prism through which character, habit, and social nuance could be discerned. In his office, he reviewed his notes systematically, weighing each minor grievance. Fleeting observation and behavioral hint, patterns emerged, not yet definitive but suggestive. Small opportunities, carefully managed routines, and unexamined assumptions had combined to create ambiguity. For Purbright, the task was not merely to find a missing object, but to navigate the human terrain in which it had vanished. Patience, discretion, and careful interpretation would be required before the threads could be pulled together. The night settled over Flaxborough with a gentle hush. Shop windows glimmered faintly, and the occasional cat padded along deserted streets. The town, outwardly unchanged, held beneath its calm a subtle tension, questions unresolved, minor secrets untouched, and small signals awaiting interpretation. Purbright, attentive to these nuances, allowed himself a quiet sense of anticipation, knowing that the unfolding of events would gradually reveal where diligence ended and human oversight, or something more, had begun. The next morning arrived crisp and bright, the kind of day that encouraged the illusion of ordinary routine, though Flaxborough's residents now carried an undercurrent of quiet scrutiny. The missing measure, still unaccounted for, had settled into the town's collective imagination, yet no single theory commanded consensus. As Purbright walked along Market Street, he noted the subtle changes: shopkeepers more alert, conversations tempered with a polite caution, and children trailing their errands with a conscious care. The town was alive with attentiveness, though the reason remained hidden beneath layers of propriety. Purbright's attention first turned to the chemist's shop, where Mr. Appledore appeared even more fidgety than usual. His spectacles were perched higher on his nose, and he tapped the counter with fingers that betrayed impatience. Miss Fowle, in contrast, maintained her composure, though her eyes occasionally darted toward the back of the shop, as if tracking an invisible rhythm. Purbright observed the quiet interplay of anxiety and poise, noting the contrast without comment, aware that subtle cues were often more revealing than overt statements. The first disturbance of the day presented itself unexpectedly. A small fire had broken out in the bakery next door to the chemist, triggered, it seemed, by a neglected oven and a batch of overbaking bread. Smoke curled upward, alarming the staff and drawing a small crowd from Market Street. While the event was minor and quickly controlled, it introduced a new variable, the need to shift attention and assess behavior under stress. Purbright noted the reactions carefully. Appledore's hands trembled, not only from the ongoing concern for his own shop, but from the sudden drama next door, while Miss Fowle's composure remained measured, though her brow furrowed briefly in distraction. The fire, minor as it was, allowed Purbright to observe the town in action. Mr. Bloxam, the fishmonger, offered assistance, but muttered a complaint about the inconvenience to his deliveries. Mrs. Gidney fretted about smoke damaging her chrysanthemums, and the postman paused, hat in hand, considering which deliveries might be delayed. Each reaction, mundane in isolation, provided insight into patterns of attention, responsibility, and priority. The town, it seemed, was quick to act, yet equally quick to comment, and both were worthy of observation. In the aftermath of the bakery incident, Purbright returned to the chemist's. He noted a small, previously overlooked detail, a faint trail of white powder extending from a rear drawer to the counter's edge. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet in combination with the earlier smudge on the note, it suggested movement and handling that had gone unnoticed. The trail did not indicate malice, he reflected, but it did point to a minor disruption in the otherwise meticulous routine of the shop. Conversations with townsfolk reinforced the new dynamic. Mrs. Fenwick, the hatter, commented on how easily minor accidents could create exaggerated concern. while Mr. Trelawney spoke with measured authority about human error. Even the postman remarked in passing on the odd sequence of events: a missing measure, a misdelivered parcel, and now a bakery fire, all within a few days. The coincidence, though statistically trivial, lent the entire situation an air of significance that might otherwise have been absent. Purbright, considering these convergences, reflected on human response to disruption. Opportunity, oversight, and minor lapses could combine to produce apparent mysteries, while the town's imagination supplied context and motive. He observed the interplay between Appledaw's mounting anxiety and Miss Fowle's controlled actions. Their differing responses to stress provided a lens through which the inspector could assess both capacity for error and the likelihood of deliberate action. By mid-afternoon, the bakery had resumed normal operations, the smoke dissipated and the ovens cooled. The crowd dispersed, leaving Flaxborough once more to its subtle routines, though now tinged with a faint tension born of recent events. Purbright noted the residual effects: a slightly more cautious approach to errands, furtive glances exchanged between shopkeepers, and a general awareness that small irregularities might have consequences beyond their immediate context. A brief walk along the riverside reinforced the broader view. Children skated along cobbles, their laughter betraying no awareness of the day's disturbances. Dogs trotted beside their owners, noses low to track the faint scent of smoke or flour. And a few townsfolk paused to discuss minor inconveniences in hushed tones, always careful to appear composed. Purbright, attuned to nuance, catalogued the interplay of attention, concern, and social performance, recognizing that these subtleties often contained more information than explicit confession or evidence. Turning to the chemist's in late afternoon, Purbright focused again on the faint trail of powder and the slightly ajar drawer. Appledaw's anxiety had increased, reflected in brief tremors of the hands and repeated, almost ritualistic checking of shelves. Miss Fowle continued to arrange objects with exactitude, yet there was a fleeting hesitation as she reached toward the drawer. Purbright's observation was quiet and methodical, noting that the tension between routine and anomaly was now becoming more pronounced, offering subtle insight into human behavior under the pressure of unresolved irregularity. By early evening, the implications of the day's second event had become clear to Purbright. The missing measure, while still absent, was now contextualized by the minor crisis at the bakery and the faint irregularities in the chemist's shop. These incidents, though not connected by overt action, created a framework in which behavior, timing, and small errors could be evaluated with greater precision. Purbright reflected that human response to stress often revealed what routine observation alone could not. The street lamps flickered on, casting warm light over cobblestones now slightly darkened by residual moisture. Shopkeepers closed for the day, children disappeared indoors, and the market square regained its familiar quiet. Yet beneath the calm, minor tensions persisted. Appledaw's careful pacing, Miss Fowle's precise movements, and the faint echoes of smoke and flour in the air. The town had resumed its outward composure, but subtle clues and patterns, carefully observed, continued to accumulate in Purbright's mind. As night approached, Purbright returned to his office, reviewing the day's events with meticulous attention. The second incident, minor as it seemed, had shifted the context, revealing new angles and amplifying the significance of previously overlooked details. The trail of powder, the behavioral contrasts, and the town's reactions now formed a richer tapestry, one in which opportunity, diligence, and inadvertent oversight might intersect. The missing measure remained elusive, yet the narrative threads were slowly weaving toward a pattern that, in due course, could be understood. That evening, after the market square had emptied and the town's ordinary rhythms receded into quiet domesticity, Inspector Purbright remained at his desk, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating stacks of notes and observations. He allowed himself a rare moment of solitude, reflecting upon the events of the past several days and the delicate interplay of human nature and circumstance that they had revealed. Flaxborough, outwardly serene, had demonstrated its habitual intricacies, minor anxieties, fleeting gestures, and a web of social proprieties that both concealed and suggested truths. Purbright's thoughts lingered on Mr. Appledore, whose meticulous attention to order seemed at once admirable and burdensome. There was an almost visible tension in the chemist's small, precise movements, a rhythm dictated by anxiety more than necessity. The missing measure, though trivial in itself, had introduced a disruption he could not ignore, a tiny anomaly, yet sufficient to provoke disproportionate concern,
speculation, and even judgment from neighbours.
Purbright considered that the weight of perceived disorder often outweighed the significance of actual events. Miss Fowle occupied his mind next. Her composure, almost impervious to the minor crises of the day, suggested either extraordinary self-control or careful calculation. The faint hesitation noted earlier, a pause in her routine, a subtle adjustment of an object, was not yet meaningful enough to be labelled suspicious, but it was a mark, a tiny deviation in otherwise precise behaviour. Purbright reflected that ordinary people, when observed closely, often displayed small, telling inconsistencies, some benign, some revealing. It was the patient observer's task to discern which were which. He considered the reactions of the townsfolk more broadly. Mrs. Gidney's quick judgments, Mr. Trelawney's considered musings, the postman's casual remarks, all contributed to a mosaic of perception rather than evidence. Flaxborough, he noted, operated on a principle of indirect observation. Character, intention, and social standing were constantly assessed and reassessed,
often more influential than the actual facts of an event.
In this environment, a missing measure could take on significance far beyond its intrinsic value. The bakery fire of the previous day remained a point of interest. Though minor, it had disrupted routine and provided an opportunity to observe reactions under pressure. Appalled or anxious responses, calm efficiency, and minor errors all became more visible under stress. The human tendency to reveal instinctively when faced with unexpected circumstance was, Purbright recognized, a far more reliable guide than any overt confession or testimony. He reviewed the day's notes, mentally cataloguing subtle cues, tremors of hands, brief hesitations, glances diverted, and adjustments of posture. In his reflection, Purbright also considered the role of coincidence and sequence. The missing measure, the misdirected parcel, and the bakery incident might have no causal connection, yet their temporal proximity shaped perception. Patterns, he knew, could be misleading if taken at face value. Human imagination often supplied links where none existed. Nevertheless, these patterns created context, and context could illuminate hidden motives, provided one did not mistake appearance for intent. He thought further on opportunity and access. Holcomb's visit, though ostensibly mundane, intersected with the chemist's routines. The small drawer smudge, the powder trail, and Miss Fowle's precise but slightly interrupted gestures formed a constellation of minor events. None in isolation indicated deliberate action, yet the constellation suggested points at which misplacement or inadvertent interference could occur. Purbright reminded himself that in Flaxborough, the ordinary often concealed subtle irregularities that, when understood, explained the apparently extraordinary. Purbright's attention turned inward to his own methodology. Patience, careful observation, and restraint were essential. Quick judgments or assumptions risked being swayed by gossip, minor anxieties, or the charm of routine appearances. Human nature, he considered, was a collection of contradictions, pride and humility, diligence and oversight, composure and anxiety, often expressed simultaneously in ways that revealed more than words. Detecting these contradictions was as important as noting physical evidence, for behavior frequently betrayed intent before any act could. The inspector's reflection extended to moral dimensions, though lightly. The town's tendency to moralize trivial occurrences, assigning blame, crafting narratives, interpreting gestures, was both a constraint and a tool. By observing these moral interpretations, he gained insight into individual characters, who valued order above all, who deferred to appearances, who sought subtle advantage. Each minor observation contributed to an understanding of the social landscape, which in turn shaped the probabilities of behavior and misplacement. He considered the day's observations chronologically, mentally reviewing Appledaw's anxious pacing, Miss Fowle's poise, Holcomb's measured responses, and the town's whispered judgments. Patterns emerged, though not yet decisive. Stress revealed tendencies, routines masked deviation, and the interplay of attention and distraction produced moments of insight. A single observation, such as the faint powder trail, gained significance when assessed in conjunction with gestures, speech, and minor inconsistencies elsewhere. As night deepened, Purbright allowed himself the faintest satisfaction. The day had provided clarity not in certainty, but in possibilities, human behavior under minor disruption, the subtle interplay of diligence and error, and the emergence of patterns that might, in time, reveal the measure's disappearance. The process, slow and meticulous, demanded quiet reflection, careful record-keeping, and patient observation. Flaxborough, he reflected, offered a perfect theatre for such study, where small incidents could illuminate character, motive, and circumstance without the need for overt dramatics. Finally, he leaned back, eyes moving over the dimly lit blotter, and considered what the next day might reveal. Minor irregularities awaited observation, behaviors under stress would be telling, and social interactions would continue to expose subtle truths. For Purbright, understanding the town, its routines, and its human tendencies was as vital as discovering the missing measure itself. With that, he extinguished the lamp, the quiet of his office matching the deeper stillness of the sleeping town outside, confident that insight, patience, and reflection would gradually draw the hidden threads into view. The morning light filtered softly through Purbright's office window, casting a pattern of rectangles across his blotter. The town remained its familiar self outside, shops opening, deliveries arranged, children scurrying along cobbled streets. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, subtle tensions persisted. Purbright, mindful of the human patterns he had catalogued over the past days, contemplated a discreet strategy. Observation alone had yielded a collection of behaviors and inconsistencies. Now it was time to allow circumstances to reveal more, through the gentle pressure of a carefully arranged situation. He left the office mid-morning, walking with measured pace toward the Chemist's. The air carried the usual mixture of autumn leaves and baking bread, the scents indistinguishable yet comforting in their ordinariness. Appledore, already at the shop, greeted him with an anxious nod, spectacles slightly askew. Miss Fowle stood by the counter, polished and composed, though Purbright noted the faint quickening of her pulse as he approached. It was subtle, but sufficient to register. "Good morning, Mr. Appledore, Miss Fowle," he said, nodding politely. "I was hoping to observe your opening routine today, if you don't mind." His tone suggested casual interest, but the underlying purpose was clear to him: a careful, unobtrusive test, allowing the natural order of activity to reveal hidden tendencies. As Appledore prepared the counter and Miss Fowle arranged the bottles, Purbright noted gestures, pauses, and slight adjustments. The chemist, aware of the inspector's scrutiny, performed each movement with excessive care, adjusting the smallest jars and rechecking shelves, his anxiety manifesting in tremulous hands and frequent glances toward the counter. Miss Fowle, meanwhile, executed her duties with calm precision. Yet there were micro-moments, a lingering touch, a shift in stance, that betrayed subtle awareness of his watchfulness. Purbright allowed the morning to unfold, speaking occasionally in neutral tones, asking about routine and supplies, but never directly confronting the missing measure. The strategy was to observe behavior under a controlled, minimally pressured environment, noting responses to implied attention rather than direct questioning. In Flaxborough, the human mind often revealed itself more in actions than in words, particularly when individuals felt unobserved yet knew they were being considered. Mid-morning brought a minor disturbance. A misdelivered parcel arrived at the shop, its address obscured by an overlapping label. Appledore reached for it with heightened care, and Miss Fowle followed his movements with exacting attention. Purbright observed the interplay, the chemist's meticulous scrutiny, the assistant's poised observation, and the subtle tension in both parties' postures. It was precisely the type of scenario that might illuminate an oversight or reveal intent, depending on the individual's habitual response. As he made note of small gestures, the precise alignment of bottles, the subtle shift in stance when a drawer was opened, the brief hesitation before handling the misdelivered parcel, Purbright recognized a pattern. Minor irregularities that had previously seemed isolated now appeared in context, forming a network of behavioral tendencies. Each micro-event added weight to his mental calculus, offering insight without the need for explicit admission. By early afternoon, a customer entered the shop, a local schoolteacher delivering a note for Appledore regarding the town's educational grant. The interruption was innocuous, yet it provided a fresh opportunity for observation. The chemist's hands trembled slightly more than usual, and Miss Fowle's attention momentarily faltered before returning to her duties. Purbright filed these observations quietly. The interplay of attention, minor anxiety, and responsibility was increasingly informative. He also noted incidental reactions, a shelf slightly misaligned, a faint powder residue near the rear drawer, and the pattern of glances between Appledore and his assistant. Individually, each was trivial. Collectively, they suggested subtle disturbances in routine, micro-displacements that might indicate minor misplacement or inadvertent handling of the missing measure. The morning's test, as quietly conducted, had begun to yield a richer sense of the shop's internal dynamics. By late afternoon, Purbright reflected upon the exercise. The controlled observation had produced behavioral cues he might not have detected through direct questioning. Heightened anxiety in Appledore, micro-hesitations in Miss Fowle, and small but telling irregularities in routine tasks. Human nature, he considered, often revealed itself under subtle pressure when the individual believed they were being watched without confrontation. The balance between composure and minor disturbance provided insight into potential causes of the measure's disappearance. He concluded the day with a brief conversation, casually inquiring about minor deliveries and the routine arrangement of instruments. Both Appledore and Miss Fowle responded politely, their words neutral, but the earlier patterns remained. Tremors, hesitations, glances. Purbright filed these mental notes alongside the previously observed powder trail and the smudged note, beginning to see the outlines of a behavioral map that would guide further steps. As dusk fell, Flaxborough resumed its usual tranquility, though beneath the surface the web of observation continued to expand. Shopkeepers closed, children returned home, and the market square emptied, leaving a town outwardly unchanged. Within the chemist's shop, small tensions lingered, now illuminated by the inspector's deliberate test. Purbright, returning to his office, reflected on the morning's insights, confident that patient observation and carefully orchestrated minor disturbances had brought him closer to understanding the convergence of opportunity, behavior, and circumstance responsible for the missing measure. He reviewed his notes once more, noting the interplay of actions, minor irregularities, and human tendencies. The test had not produced explicit confession, nor was it intended to. Rather, it had revealed patterns and signals that would inform the next stage of his inquiry. With the quiet satisfaction of careful preparation, he extinguished his desk lamp, allowing the soft night to settle over Flaxborough, confident that the town itself, in its habitual routines, would continue to provide subtle guidance toward eventual clarity. The following morning dawned grey and chilly, with mist curling around the cobbles of Market Street as if the town itself wished to obscure its usual clarity. Flaxborough, outwardly placid, seemed to carry a subtle tension that was almost imperceptible to casual observers. Shopkeepers opened their doors with habitual efficiency, yet eyes lingered slightly longer than customary on passers-by, and conversations were punctuated by careful phrasing, as if each resident measured their words against some unseen standard. Purbright set out after breakfast, walking deliberately toward the chemist's shop. His attention was drawn not only to the physical layout, but to the way individuals interacted with it and with one another. Appledore, already at work, exhibited a faint tremor in his hands as he arranged bottles and small instruments. Miss Fowle, though outwardly composed, displayed subtle signs of awareness, a quick glance at the rear drawer, a slight shift in posture as she moved along the counter. Purbright observed without comment, noting each minute movement as a potential indicator of thought or intention. By mid-morning, the inspector had arranged an unspoken test. He lingered near the rear of the shop, ostensibly attending to paperwork, while allowing the natural rhythm of activity to proceed. The misdelivered parcel, left momentarily on the counter, became a focal point. Appledore approached it with his usual care, while Miss Fowle adjusted a small tray of powders with precise, almost ritualistic attention. Purbright observed the timing, sequence, and micro-adjustments of each motion, noting that the assistant's hesitation, however brief, seemed to correspond with the presence of an object in her vicinity. A customer arrived, an elderly lady delivering a small note for Appledore. Her entrance was unremarkable, yet it provided a further lens through which to observe behavior under mild disruption. Appledore's pacing quickened slightly, the tremor in his hands more pronounced. Miss Fowle's eyes flicked briefly toward the drawer, then returned to routine with measured composure. Purbright allowed the situation to play out, recognizing that minor stress could illuminate tendencies concealed in calm moments. By noon, the inspector had noted additional subtleties: the alignment of instruments, the positioning of glass bottles, and a faint trace of white powder on the counter's edge, not previously apparent. Each was insignificant alone, yet together they suggested careful handling or minor displacement, patterns that hinted at opportunity or inadvertent interference. The juxtaposition of composure and slight tremor provided insight into the contrasts between habitual precision and response to observation. Later, in conversation with Mrs. Fenwick at the Hatters, Purbright reflected on human inclination to preserve appearance. She noted casually that people often overcompensated for minor lapses, performing with exaggerated attention to restore perceived order. Purbright found the remark apt. He had witnessed similar compensatory behavior in the chemist's shop, gestures and adjustments that revealed unease and attentiveness simultaneously. It was precisely these subtleties, rather than overt statements, that guided the accumulation of understanding. By mid-afternoon, a delivery boy arrived carrying a bundle of letters, one of which had been misdirected the previous day. The minor event produced a sequence of small movements: Appledore's careful handling, Miss Fowle's rapid check of compartments, and a slight pause as both glanced toward the rear drawer. Purbright observed the hesitation without interference, aware that the tension between routine and uncertainty was now more pronounced, providing additional information on habitual response under scrutiny. Walking briefly to the riverside, he reflected on the town's overall pattern. Residents' whispers, cautious glances, and measured speech formed a social lattice in which minor incidents were amplified and interpreted according to local assumptions. Each micro-behavior, glances, gestures, pauses, offered insight into intent and opportunity. Flaxborough, Purbright recognized, was a theatre in which ordinary routines masked subtle irregularities, the invisible threads of human nature woven tightly beneath the surface. Returning to the chemist's late in the afternoon, Purbright observed a final sequence before leaving. Appledaw's pacing had slowed, hands now steadier, but movements slightly mechanical. Miss Fowle's poised attention remained, yet the faint hesitation when reaching toward the drawer persisted. The traces of powder, the prior smudge, and the subtle contrasts between anxiety and composure combined to suggest a pattern that was slowly emerging. Each element, he reflected, was a piece of the behavioral map, a map necessary to understand the sequence of minor events that had culminated in the missing measure. As dusk approached, the street lamps flickered on, casting soft pools of light across Market Street. The town resumed its apparent tranquility, though beneath the surface tension remained. Shopkeepers closed doors with deliberate care. Children returned home, and the market square was left to shadows. Yet within the chemist's shop, a quiet unease lingered. Tremors, glances, and minute adjustments signaled the presence of unresolved matters. Purbright, returning to his office, reviewed the day's observations, noting the patterns of behavior, hesitation, and composure that suggested the guilty party was becoming increasingly aware of scrutiny. He sat at his desk, the lamp casting a steady glow over his blotter, considering the convergence of clues, observations, and behavioral inconsistencies. The field of inquiry was narrowing, though no overt confession had occurred. Minor disturbances had revealed tendencies and reactions, and the careful application of observation had begun to unsettle those whose actions were under scrutiny. The day's accumulated insights, quietly and deliberately gathered, provided the foundation for the final, civil unraveling of the mystery in the coming days. The morning arrived with a subdued light that softened the outlines of Market Street, giving Flaxborough the appearance of ordinary civility once more. Yet beneath this surface, subtle tensions persisted. Shopkeepers moved with habitual care, and pedestrians walked with polite awareness, as though the town itself remembered the minor disruptions of recent days. Purbright, walking at his usual measured pace, noted the faint glances exchanged in passing, the micro-adjustments of posture, the careful phrasing of greetings, all signals, he knew, that human behavior often betrayed in the presence of observation. He entered the chemist's shop at mid-morning. Appledaw was arranging bottles with meticulous care, his hands steadier than the previous day, though the slight tremor of anxiety lingered. Miss Fowle remained composed, attending to minor details, with precision, yet there was a barely perceptible tension in her gestures. Purbright allowed himself to observe quietly, speaking only when a comment on routine offered an opportunity to note reactions. His aim was deliberate, to bring subtle awareness to bear without overt confrontation, permitting the behaviors he had catalogued over days to crystallize into comprehension. The first customer of the morning, a local clerk delivering a letter for Appledaw, provided the opening Purbright had anticipated. The chemist's brief pause, the careful handling of the letter, and Miss Fowle's rapid glance toward the rear drawer created the tableau the inspector had been waiting to observe. He noted each micro-movement, the cadence of attention, and the interplay of composure and minor agitation. It was, he reflected, precisely these interactions under low pressure that revealed tendencies previously hidden beneath routine. By mid-morning, Purbright had arranged a small scenario designed to elicit responses without overtly directing them. He asked Appledaw to fetch a seldom-used measure from a rear cupboard, ostensibly to verify stock, while observing Miss Fowle's reactions unobtrusively. The assistant's hesitation, brief but discernible, and the subtle shift of weight as she positioned herself near the counter, indicated awareness that went beyond mere curiosity. Purbright catalogued these observations silently, allowing the behavioral data to accumulate without commentary. As he observed, minor details emerged that tied together previous irregularities. the smudge on the note, the faint powder trail. On the counter, the subtle misalignment of instruments and the rehearsed yet imperfect composure of Miss Fowle. Appledaw's anxiety, though real, had not altered these patterns. It was her restrained reactions, micro-adjustments, and brief interruptions of routine that suggested an underlying connection to the measure's disappearance. Purbright's patience, he reflected, had allowed these small signals to become coherent. A brief interruption occurred in the form of a delivery of small parcels, which Appledaw accepted with heightened attentiveness. Miss Fowle assisted, positioning each package with exactitude. Purbright observed the precise timing of glances, slight hesitations in handling, and the coordination of gestures. The micro-patterns, once isolated, now appeared as a network, behaviors that suggested opportunity, awareness, and inadvertent concealment rather than overt malice. By early afternoon, the threads of observation converged. Purbright noted the repetition of specific micro-behaviors under low-pressure conditions, the subtle adjustments in routine, and the interplay between anxiety and composure. It became increasingly evident that the missing measure had not been forcibly taken or maliciously concealed. Rather, it had been displaced in a manner consistent with inadvertent handling during moments of minor distraction. Miss Fowle's brief hesitation, the powder smudge, and the faint trail of displacement all pointed toward this conclusion. Purbright addressed the chemist with deliberate calm, inquiring about the process of stock verification and the handling of the measures during routine operations. Appledaw's responded with slight relief, eager to clarify his diligence, while Miss Fowle maintained composure, her responses precise but tinged with faint self-consciousness. The conversation, carefully balanced, allowed Purbright to confirm the convergence of behavioral cues with physical evidence. Without accusation or alarm, by late afternoon, the inspector had gathered sufficient insight to reconstruct the sequence of events. The missing measure had been inadvertently displaced during a routine check, handled with diligence but minor oversight, and momentarily unobserved. The small powder smudge and faint trail served as physical corroboration of behavior he had observed. Micro-gestures of adjustment, repeated checking, and the natural misalignment of objects over successive handling. All elements once accumulated aligned with the narrative of minor human error rather than deliberate theft. As dusk settled over Flaxborough, Purbright reviewed his notes and reflections. The town, outwardly unchanged, had performed its usual roles, yet, under scrutiny, human nature revealed itself in small, telling patterns. Composure, hesitation, attention, and minor irregularity had coalesced into a coherent understanding. The missing measure, elusive in its absence, had been displaced not by malice, but by the intersection of routine, diligence, and momentary distraction, a subtle disturbance rendered visible through patient observation. Purbright left the chemist's shop with the quiet satisfaction of completion. The behavioral patterns, minor physical traces, and social context now formed a complete tableau, allowing a civil and precise explanation to be offered. The town's routines continued, seemingly unperturbed, yet the minor tensions and curiosities had been resolved through understanding rather than accusation. In the soft glow of evening, the inspector returned to his office, confident that the convergence of insight, patience, and careful observation had illuminated the truth with minimal disruption to Flaxborough's ordinary life. The morning sun fell softly over Market Street, illuminating Flaxborough in a pale autumnal light that rendered every cobble and shuttered window with gentle clarity. The town moved with its habitual calm, yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, subtle tensions lingered. Shopkeepers opened their doors with careful precision, and pedestrians carried themselves with an alert civility, the memory of recent days' minor disturbances still perceptible in measured gestures. Purbright, walking toward the chemist's shop, observed all with his usual attentiveness, noting the subtle cues that had accumulated in his understanding over the past 10 days. At Appledores, the chemist greeted him with cautious relief, spectacles perched carefully on his nose, fingers still slightly trembling as they arranged bottles. Miss Fowle, attentive yet restrained, acknowledged him with a quiet nod, her composure immaculate, though the faint trace of awareness persisted in her posture. Purbright allowed the morning to unfold naturally, speaking politely about routine matters while quietly observing the interplay of anxiety, composure, and habitual attention. The stage was prepared for a civil explanation, one that would illuminate events without scandal or accusation. After a brief period of watching the usual movements, Appledore checking shelves, Miss Fowle arranging powders with meticulous care, Purbright spoke gently, drawing both into conversation. "I believe," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "that the missing measure has caused more concern than it truly warranted. Yet, as we have observed, small irregularities often become amplified when routine is disrupted." He paused, allowing the words to settle, and continued, "Through observation, patterns have emerged, both in the handling of instruments and in the subtle adjustments made during daily tasks." Miss Fowle's eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing. Appledore inclined his head, the tension in his shoulders evident but restrained. Purbright gestured toward the rear drawer and the faint trail of powder. "These minor traces," he continued, "suggest that the measure was inadvertently displaced during normal handling. The smudge on the note, the slight powder trail, and micro-adjustments in positioning all align with a moment of oversight rather than deliberate concealment." He allowed the explanation to breathe in the quiet space of the shop, noting the reactions. Appledore exhaled audibly, relief softening the previously tight line of his mouth, while Miss Fowle's composure relaxed just enough to betray acknowledgement without embarrassment. Purbright continued calmly, describing the sequence of routine checks, the minor displacement of instruments, and the manner in which micro-behaviors, hesitation, careful glances, and repeated alignment of objects revealed the true course of events. "The measure," Purbright concluded, "was neither stolen nor intentionally hidden. It became temporarily misplaced in the course of maintaining precision, an understandable occurrence given the meticulous nature of the work. Your diligence has prevented greater error, yet even the most careful routine is subject to minor irregularities." His tone was courteous, civil, and entirely devoid of accusation, the hallmark of his understated method. Appledore's relief deepened, evident in the softening of gestures and the gradual steadiness of his hands. Miss Fowle's acknowledgement was subtler, a slight nod and an almost imperceptible relaxation of posture, indicating understanding without overt admission. Purbright noted the contrasts, tension giving way to composure, anxiety replaced by measured calm, all without public embarrassment or disruption. The explanation had achieved clarity while preserving dignity. Later, as Purbright departed, he observed the town resuming its normal rhythm. Shopkeepers closed and reopened with habitual care, deliveries proceeded without deviation, and the market square echoed with familiar sounds of commerce and social exchange. Flaxborough, outwardly unchanged, carried beneath its calm a subtle shift. Minor tensions resolved, awareness of human imperfection acknowledged, and the rhythm of ordinary life gently restored. Walking back along the cobbled streets, Purbright reflected on the interplay of observation, patience, and human nature. The missing measure had provided insight into behavior, attention, and reaction. By allowing subtle tests, careful observation, and civil explanation, he had revealed the truth without creating scandal or discomfort. Human nature, he thought, often revealed itself most clearly under gentle scrutiny rather than confrontation, and even minor incidents could illuminate character, motive, and social dynamics. By evening, the town had settled fully into its habitual calm. Street lamps glimmered along Market Street, children's laughter faded into domestic routines, and the gentle rustle of autumn leaves marked the quiet passage of time. At his office, Purbright catalogued the day's observations, noting the convergence of minor behavioral cues, physical evidence, and social interaction that had led to a coherent understanding. The measure was returned to its proper place, the shop's routine restored, and the town's collective curiosity finally satisfied without overt disclosure. As night deepened, Purbright allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of completion. The minor mystery had illuminated patterns of human behavior, opportunity, and diligence. The town, while outwardly unchanged, had experienced a subtle shift in awareness, a reminder that even the most ordinary routines were shaped by observation, care, and attention. The missing measure, now resolved, stood as testament to patience, civil discourse, and the quiet power of measured scrutiny. In the soft darkness of his office, Purbright reflected on the resolution. Nothing had been forced, no accusation necessary. Insight had emerged naturally from careful observation and subtle guidance. Flaxborough, its rhythms restored, held beneath its familiar surface the knowledge that small disturbances revealed character and routine in ways that were enlightening rather than disruptive. The inspector, satisfied that the mystery had run its natural course, turned his attention to paperwork, the quiet work that awaited after every day of observation and reflection.